then to say that
Calling you down for that.
by equation, it is worse to be a woman, that there's something fundamentally wrong about a man who has female characteristics.
It's more about the definition rather than the use.
But even the use has sort of been swallowed up when kids say, well, that's so gay. They don't mean that it is, like, oh man, the test today was so gay. They don't mean that the test has, consensual, loving sex with tests of the same kind. They don't mean that. But they are using the word gay as a placeholder for negative ideologies, which then get applied to people, whether it's valid or not. It scapegoats an entire segment of the population who go by that same out, and it's a direct reference to them. So,
however, there is this sense of you mentioned the word nigger. That word has been completely co-opted and changed to some degree.
I would say completely, yeah.
No, I mean, clearly, but it now has a whole new level of connotation, which is not negative, where one black can call another black nigger, and it's a bonding.
Although they wouldn't pronounce the R. You pronounce the R, you get fucking shot. That's
Okay, I just wanted to talk about the effect that hate speech laws have on actually reducing hate speech, because I don't think that they actually do reduce it. I think that they do push it underground, and more specifically, they encode it, like I was saying before. Where, like, for example, Jason Kenney is our immigration minister, right? And he's like admitted that he's racist, maybe out of frustration or like satire. But the way that he talks about race is always in the language of immigration.
Yes.
And that's the way that it's become encoded in our political discourse in Canada and the United States. So now we don't know if we're actually talking about immigration anymore or race. So things become confused when we have these hate speech laws. Like, I would rather our immigration minister say, like, I just don't like packies or something like that, and say, like, I want laws to prevent, because then we can have an honest discourse about why that's not okay to say. Whereas, like, the way
that it's not okay to say, but that it is factually incorrect.
Sorry, yes.
There's no reasonable rational basis for that.
Exactly, and that's an important, actually, qualification, which is something I wanted to say, which is that in the United States, even though they don't have hate speech laws, they effectively enforce the reduction of hate speech through, like, public shaming in the same way.
Where pressure.
Yeah, where it's like, what was that guy? The guy said nappy-headed whores about the back.
Hose, but yeah.
Hose, sorry, nappy-headed hose. The response to him wasn't like, do you understand why that's not okay? It wasn't like, can you explain to us why that's not okay? And, like, it was stop saying that. You should be fired. You should be taken off the air.
Yeah.
That's not a productive response to, like, hateful or racist.
Especially when he turns around and says, I'm a free speech crusader.
Yeah.
Laura Schlesinger got dinged for the same thing. And she was like, well,
exactly.
The liberal media is taking away my First Amendment rights. No, they're not. Just people don't want to hear your racist tirades.
No, exactly. The response, like the response to Laura Schlesinger's, like 13 times saying nigger or whatever, was you should be taken off the air.
But
the correct response should be, do you even understand why that's not okay? Like, do you understand how it's different for a black person to call another black person?
So I want to jump in there, because the response was not she should be taken off the air. That's not a fair characterization of the response. The people who own the station that she broadcasts on said, there's no way that people are going to want to listen to her anymore. We're going to lose all kinds of funding if we keep her on. Same thing that happened with Glenn Beck. So they told her, pack in the show.
Yeah.
It wasn't as though there were headlines saying,
okay,
Schlesinger should be fired.
What I mean by response is the popular response, the not like what they actually
And
think.
there were a number of people who went out of their way, myself among them, to specifically point out this by point exactly why she was way out of bounds and why.
I think that's the right way to do it. But in the United States and Canada, I think like our response is generally like, you should keep that quiet, which has the effect of just encoding homophobia, racism, sexism in other language, so that we're no longer saying nigger, we're saying like...
That has nothing to do with
hate
hate speech laws.
Like safe sex, it doesn't spread anything. If it keeps it underground.
It's not underground.
It's not okay
That's
to
my
say
point.
it.
It's not underground.
But when we encode it, and our brains are so good at self-justification that we can't even admit to ourselves our racism or our
Yes.
sexism. And we adjust our brain parameters into using this code, and we don't even know it.
All of these prejudices become more powerful when they're elided, which means hidden. When we're not aware of them.
Getting back
Yeah.
to your point about burying racist language in discussion of immigration. Canada's a country built on immigration. Every one of us came, sometimes came from somewhere else.
Not me.
Damn.
Okay, so you're as old as Canadian Shield. Fine.
Fucking right. I was there when the Rockies were built. Those shits were hard.
The Rockies are babies.
But yes, nation of immigrants, go on.
And so it's legitimate to have conversations about immigration. People come from different cultures. But having an immigration minister who buries racist talk about immigration, like, I am against elements that are presented in Sharia law. They go against my sensibilities of freedoms a person should have. And so when you lose the ability to discuss about a group coming to the country wanting to bring Sharia law with them, I mean, you bury that in the vague language of immigration when there's a legitimate concern for rights and freedom of people inside that community that endorses Sharia law. But it gets buried under immigration and euphemisms, where it's like, Sharia law is something I do not want in my community. I have nothing against Muslims, Chinese, Italians, Dutch, Irishmen in my community. It's laws that go against any person in any of those groups or outside those groups having their freedoms compromised, and cultures that have anti-freedom sentiments inside them, and burying that in weak language about immigration is getting away from the point.
But what about...
Sorry.
Yeah. I actually just wanted to reinforce the point that you just kind of mumbled there at the end. I don't know, like, you've raised this point a couple of times, and I don't actually know what it really has to do with hate speech laws, because what we're really talking about here is a lot more cultural than hate speech laws. And you even made the point of the fact that they don't have hate speech laws in the U.S. and the same sort of things happen. It's all to do. I think it's a lot more to do with the culture that we establish in terms of how openly we talk about things and how much we're trying to be nice to each other and so on and so forth. And so it sounds to me like related to that, part of the point you're making is that the hate speech laws, especially since they're so open to interpretation and so forth, are pretty much irrelevant or ineffective. In other words, what I mean is that, what I mean is like cultural pressure and cultural changes and influences are really what's going to make a difference, not some hate speech.
That may in fact be the case. I'm not going to come down, not yet anyway, on one side or another of that question.
But the reason why I was saying that is I think they aren't effective in the way that they're supposed to be positive, and they are effective in ways that are negative, that actually stifle legitimate speech.
Yeah, I don't think. Sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't think that it's there's a correlation causation thing going on there, and I like your point. It's interesting about how eliding the hate speech gets more subtle and coded, but that's not necessarily a result of the laws.
No.
It could be just like the culture thing.
Yeah.
And I would argue that in fact maybe if the laws do help in making hate speech or discriminatory speech less socially acceptable, then it's going to happen anyway. It's going to become coded anyway. It's part of the process. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. And
They might facilitate it though.
yeah. And one other thing I want to mention in terms of whether the hate speech laws are effective or not in Canada. I don't know how many actual what the case law is or how many prosecutions or convictions there actually have been. I've heard not very many. But that would be one way of kind of trying to measure it. But another example I was thinking of too is in Germany, where they make Holocaust denials against the law.
That's in the whole EU.
Yeah. So and that's been in place for a while. So has there been studies? What's the effects there? Has it been driven underground? Is it negative effects? Has it helped? Like what?
Yeah, and that's a reasonable thing to try to actually measure.
I just wanted to bring up one point. I sort of gather that the consensus here is that there seems to be like no real like measurable like gain to like the hate speech laws, whereas there could be potential harm because like all these groups get driven underground or whatever. But I want to bring up the point that, okay, likewise, I think the grievances of the groups being targeted, if there's no hate speech laws, could just as easily be driven underground. And then, I don't know, they might think like, oh, this country does not have any public policy process whatsoever in dealing with this sort of shit. Whether, yeah, I don't know. I think that's something else to be considered in this case too.
The thing that really bothers me just when it comes to having hate speech laws, because I'm kind of a fence sitter to be quite honest on this particular issue, is the application of them, and as I think everyone in here has discussed, but also the real fear to me is when the logical criticism of anything, any culture, any group, any individual, or any thought, any ideology can be construed as hate. Right? When you cannot criticize anyone or anything anymore, or come to, investigate something, or, make a philosophical or other kind of argument saying that this is bad or this is bad, because it might be construed as hateful. So that's the real fear to me.
Rod. Oh, I was wondering if I could get a specific example for the question 2 that you have. As a minority group, are atheists, agnostics, humanists more likely to benefit from legal protection or prosecuted speaking against religion? Especially that last part. Is there a specific example you can think of that we would get prosecuted under the Canadian hate speech laws that the U.S. would be able to say that's a legitimate criticism?
I can give you a hypothetical.
Yeah.
If we had, let's say that the next cafe inquiry was about Islam, or let's say specifically Sharia law, whether or not Canada should have Sharia law. And we came in and said, well, since they're wrong anyway, whether or not Sharia law is fair and just to women, and we can put all those aside for a second, because they're fucking wrong. They are incorrect about the fact that there is a God that wants them to do these things. So it's a non-starter question because they're wrong. And we have the Muslim Student Association of SFU holding a thing in the next room, and someone goes into the wrong room, and then they come back and they say, those atheists are in there talking shit about Muslims. Now, especially with we are right now incredibly sensitive to the legitimate discrimination against Muslims that happens in North America. Society is very, very sensitive to that. It doesn't take a leap of wild imagining to think that someone could be brought before a human rights tribunal to defend themselves for legitimate comments that they've made criticizing the Muslim religion and also Muslims for believing in the Muslim religion.
Well, that's exactly what happened to Ezra Levant.
So
he
there
was
you go.
literally brought to the Human Rights Tribunal for expressing criticism.
So, as an atheist,
yeah.
as atheists who are inherently not necessarily hostile but opposed to in a philosophical way religion, any religious group can feel persecuted by someone saying your beliefs are incorrect. And in that case, because we are trying to introduce non-theistic ideas into the general discourse, we may be, in fact, more likely to be targeted by overzealous advocates of hate speech restrictions. I obviously don't think that those are legitimate criticisms, but it doesn't seem to be beyond the realm of possibility that such an occurrence could take place.
An example of someone having called something that atheists or non-theistic groups activities hate speech. Stockwell Day has repeatedly characterized the atheist bus campaigns that CFI has been putting on as hate speech.
What have they been?
There's
Just
one we
probably
know
not.
God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. CFI Canada handled and the Free Thought Association of Canada handled the atheist bus campaigns last year in Canada and in Kelowna and Kamloops starting this week.
And in America, that would not be an issue.
Well,
No.
I don't think they could prosecute for it.